Ethan adjusted his boots as he stepped off the sleek transport pod onto the vibrant surface of Zoria Prime. The air was thick with the scent of alien flowers, their colors so vivid they seemed to shimmer in the soft light of the twin suns. This wasn't just another exploratory mission. For Ethan, it was personal. The settlement buzzed with activity as humans and locals mingled, trading stories and goods. Among them was Leora, her pale blue skin glowing faintly in the sunlight. She stood out effortlessly with her flowing white hair and delicate features, her laughter carrying across the crowd. Ethan couldn't help but watch her, captivated. "Ethan, you're staring again," joked Jace, his crewmate and closest friend. Ethan shook his head, pretending to focus on the alien fruits being displayed at a nearby stall. "I'm just curious about their culture." Jace raised an eyebrow. "Sure, let's call it curiosity." Just then, Leora approached with her characteristic playful smirk. "Still studying our ways, Earthling," she teased, her melodic voice laced with amusement. Ethan fumbled for a response, but she didn't wait for one. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her gaze steady. "I've heard you're a botanist," she said, her tone suddenly more serious. "Does that mean you're good with flowers?" Ethan nodded. "I'd like to think so." "Why?" Leora's smirk returned. "There's a flower here on Zoria Prime, the Eterna bloom. It's said to be the rarest and most beautiful in the galaxy, but it only grows in the wildest parts of the jungle, far from where anyone dares to venture." Ethan tilted his head. "And you've seen this flower?" She laughed, the sound light and teasing. "No one has. It's just a myth. But if someone were to find it, well, they'd certainly earn my respect. Maybe more." Her words lingered in the air, half a jest, half a challenge. Ethan's heart raced. There was a glint in her eyes that made him wonder if she was serious. "Is that so?" he said, trying to match her confidence. "Then maybe I'll find it." Leora raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. "You? A human? Our jungles are no place for someone like you. They're dangerous, unpredictable." Ethan crossed his arms, his competitive nature sparked. "I'm not afraid of a challenge." "Good," she said, stepping closer, "because it's not just any flower. The Eterna bloom is said to symbolize eternal bonds, unbreakable promises. Finding it isn't just about bravery, it's about determination." Jace nudged Ethan. "You know she's just messing with you, right?" But Ethan couldn't shake the thrill of the idea. He met Leora's gaze with unwavering determination. "If it's real, I'll find it." Leora tilted her head, her teasing smirk softening slightly. "We'll see, but don't say I didn't warn you." As she walked away, Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Jace sighed dramatically. "You've got that look again." "What look?" Ethan asked. "The I'm about to do something crazy look." Ethan grinned. "Maybe. But if that flower's out there, I'm going to find it." Jace groaned. "You're really doing this for a girl?" "It's not just about her," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's about proving that humans can rise to any challenge." That night, as the settlement quieted and the twin moons rose over Zoria Prime, Ethan began planning his journey into the wilds. Maps, tools, and supplies were laid out meticulously. He knew the risks were immense: deadly creatures, unpredictable weather, and the sheer unknown of the jungle. But the thought of Leora's teasing smile and her barely veiled challenge made it impossible to back down. Ethan didn't just want to find the Eterna bloom. He needed to. For himself, for humanity, and maybe, just maybe, for the chance to see Leora's face when he returned triumphant. Ethan sat under the dim glow of a lantern in the settlement's modest library. Scrolls, datapads, and holographic maps cluttered the table in front of him. His eyes scanned the details intently, searching for any mention of the Eterna bloom. The jungle was vast, a sprawling tapestry of dense trees, hidden valleys, and unpredictable terrain. Finding one specific flower in such a place seemed nearly impossible. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Jace asked, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. Ethan didn't look up. I told you, it's not just about her. It's about the challenge. Jace sighed and stepped closer. Ethan, I know you love pushing limits, but the jungles of Zoria Prime aren't just some nature hike. People don't come back from there. That's what makes it worth doing, Ethan replied, finally looking up. His eyes were alight with determination. The Eterna bloom isn't just a flower. It's a symbol of perseverance, of facing the impossible and coming out stronger. Besides, don't you want to prove humans can handle anything this galaxy throws at us? Jace shook his head but couldn't hide a small grin. You're impossible. Fine. If you're really doing this, at least take advice from someone who knows this place better than you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Who? Later that evening, Ethan found himself in the quiet home of Crix, a Zorian elder known for his wisdom and knowledge of the planet's untamed wilds. The room smelled faintly of dried herbs and spices, and shelves were lined with artifacts and glowing stones. So, Crix began, his voice deep and resonant. You seek the Eterna bloom. Ethan nodded. I've heard it's more than just a myth. Crix chuckled softly. Myths often hold grains of truth, but they also come with warnings. The Eterna bloom is said to grow in a hidden valley called Solaris Cradle, a place of great beauty and danger. Few have ventured there, and fewer still have returned. That doesn't scare me, Ethan said, leaning forward. I'm ready for whatever it takes. Crix studied him for a moment, his golden eyes reflecting the light of the room. The jungle will test you, human. It is alive, ever-changing. The predators are not the only threat. The very air can deceive you, but you have the look of one who won't turn back. Ethan smiled. You've got that right. Crix reached for a small worn map and handed it to Ethan. This is the closest thing to a guide you'll find. It marks the general direction of Solaris Cradle, but the path changes with the jungle. Trust your instincts, not just your tools. Ethan took the map, studying its rough lines and markings. Thank you, Crix. This means a lot. Remember, Crix said as Ethan stood to leave, the Eterna bloom is not just a flower. It is a test of heart and resolve. Only those who are truly worthy will find it. The next morning, Ethan packed his gear, lightweight tools, a water filtration device, a compact shelter, and enough food for several days. He also added a small knife and a flare gun, just in case. The map was carefully folded and tucked into his jacket pocket. As he prepared to leave, Leora appeared, her expression a mix of amusement and curiosity. You're really going through with it? She asked. Ethan slung his pack over his shoulder. I said I would, didn't I? She stepped closer, her teasing smirk softening. You know, I wasn't entirely serious about the challenge. It was just a joke. Well, I'm not joking, Ethan replied. I'll find it. You'll see. For a moment, her confident demeanor faltered, replaced by something almost vulnerable. Be careful, Ethan. The jungle. It's not kind. Ethan smiled. Neither am I when I'm determined. As he stepped into the wilderness, the settlement faded behind him, replaced by the towering trees and the hum of alien wildlife. The jungle loomed ahead, both inviting and foreboding. Ethan's heart raced with excitement and a hint of fear. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but that was exactly why he couldn't wait to begin. The first steps into the jungle felt like entering another world. Towering trees stretched endlessly into the sky, their trunks wrapped in thick, twisting vines. Vibrant plants glowed faintly in the shadows, casting the forest floor in hues of blue and green. Strange sounds filled the air, chirps, growls, and an occasional unearthly howl that made Ethan grip the strap of his pack a little tighter. This is fine, he muttered to himself, pushing aside a large fern-like plant. Just another hike. A really dangerous alien hike. The jungle was alive in every sense of the word. Plants swayed gently even though there was no breeze, and the ground pulsed faintly under his boots as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Every few steps, something new would catch Ethan's eye. A flower that folded shut as he passed, or a cluster of tiny creatures scurrying across a mossy rock. For the first few hours, Ethan made steady progress. He used Crix's map to guide him, marking his path on his wrist device. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the terrain grew more challenging. The trees grew closer together, their roots twisting into a network of natural traps. Twice, he had to climb over fallen logs slick with moisture, nearly losing his footing. "Okay, so maybe this isn't just another hike," he admitted, pausing to catch his breath. He reached for his water flask and took a sip, his eyes scanning the dense foliage around him. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified in the growing twilight. A part of him wondered if Leora had been right. Was this too much for one person to handle? "No," he said firmly, shaking off the doubt. "Humans don't quit." As if to test his resolve, the jungle threw its first real challenge at him. A faint rustling sound came from the bushes to his left. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively moving to the small knife strapped to his side. The rustling grew louder, and then, without warning, something leaped out. It was a creature unlike anything Ethan had seen before, small but agile, with 6 legs and iridescent scales that shimmered like polished metal. It darted toward him, its sharp claws glinting in the fading light. Ethan stumbled back, narrowly avoiding a swipe. "All right, buddy, let's not do this," he muttered, holding the knife steady. The creature hissed, its eyes glowing faintly. It circled him, calculating its next move. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't want to hurt it, but he also didn't want to end up as its dinner. Slowly, he reached into his pack with his free hand, pulling out a flare. "Let's see how you feel about a little light show," he said, aiming the flare toward the ground. He fired. The burst of light and heat startled the creature, making it screech and retreat into the bushes. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his heart pounding. First encounter with the locals could have gone worse. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Night was falling fast, and the jungle's temperature dropped sharply. Ethan found a relatively clear spot under a large tree and set up his compact shelter. The tiny dome provided some protection, but he still felt the jungle pressing in around him. As he lay inside, his mind wandered to Leora. He could almost see her smirking at him, teasing him for thinking he could take on the jungle. "Well, I'm still here," he whispered to the empty space. "One day down, just a few more to go." The sounds of the jungle continued through the night, a mix of eerie and mesmerizing. Ethan stayed awake longer than he intended, his eyes fixed on the faint outlines of trees through the shelter's thin walls. The Eterna bloom was out there, waiting, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him from finding it. The morning came with the jungle stirring to life. Strange birds with vibrant feathers soared overhead, their songs a mix of whistles and trills. Ethan stretched his sore muscles as he packed up his shelter. The dense jungle before him seemed endless, but his resolve was unshaken. "Day 2, he murmured. "Let's see what you've got." The map Crix had given him indicated a river ahead, a natural barrier that divided the jungle. It was the only way forward, and Ethan wasn't about to turn back. As he made his way through the dense vegetation, he noticed the air growing heavier and the sounds of rushing water growing louder. Finally, the trees parted, revealing the river. It was wide, its surface shimmering under the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. The water moved with a deceptive calm, but Ethan could see the faint ripples that betrayed a strong current. He knelt by the edge, testing the water with a stick. It wasn't just deep, it was alive. Beneath the surface, shadowy shapes moved, sleek and quick. He caught glimpses of them, a flash of silver, a set of glowing eyes. They weren't just fish, they were predators, and they were watching him. "Well, this complicates things," Ethan muttered. He scanned the riverbank, looking for a safe crossing. A few rocks jutted out near the middle, but the gaps between them were too far to jump. There was no bridge, no fallen trees to use as a path. The only way across was through the water, and that wasn't an option. Ethan sat down on a rock, pulling out the map. Crix hadn't mentioned any other routes, and he was sure doubling back wasn't an option. His mind raced as he considered his options. He didn't have any advanced equipment, but he had something just as valuable: his ingenuity. He searched the nearby area, gathering sturdy vines and long, flexible branches. Using his knife, he began crafting a makeshift rope. He tied the vines tightly around the branches, creating a kind of grappling hook. It wasn't perfect, but it might give him a chance. Standing at the river's edge, Ethan swung the rope toward a sturdy-looking tree on the opposite bank. It took several tries, but finally, the hook caught. He tugged hard to test its strength, and then tied the other end around his waist. The plan was simple: cross above the water, using the rope to guide him. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." He stepped carefully into the river, gripping the rope tightly. The current pushed against his legs, nearly knocking him off balance. Beneath him, the shadows moved faster, sensing his presence. He focused on the rope, one step at a time, pulling himself forward. Halfway across, one of the creatures surged upward, its sleek body breaking the surface. It had sharp fins and a mouth lined with jagged teeth. Ethan froze, gripping the rope as the creature splashed back into the water. "Not today," he muttered, quickening his pace. The rope strained under his weight and the pull of the current, but it held firm. Step by step, he made his way to the other side, his heart pounding with every movement below. Finally, he reached the far bank, pulling himself up onto solid ground. Ethan collapsed onto the grass, breathing hard. The creatures in the river swirled beneath the surface, their glowing eyes watching as if waiting for him to fall back in. He gave them a weak smile and a two-fingered salute. "Better luck next time," he said, standing and brushing himself off. As he continued deeper into the jungle, the river's roar faded behind him. The challenge had been brutal, but it only strengthened his resolve. The Eterna bloom was waiting, and Ethan was determined to prove that no barrier, no matter how dangerous, could stop him. The jungle seemed to grow denser with every step Ethan took. The sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy now, leaving the forest floor shrouded in twilight. The air felt heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and strange flora. Every sound around him, rustling leaves, distant growls, kept him on edge. He knew he wasn't alone in this part of the jungle. Pushing aside a thick curtain of vines, Ethan entered a clearing. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that set his instincts on high alert. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its roots forming a tangled web that seemed to pulse faintly. Beneath it, the ground shimmered with small, glowing fungi, casting the area in an otherworldly light. Ethan moved cautiously, scanning the area. The map indicated he was getting closer to Solaris Cradle, the rumored home of the Eterna bloom. But this place didn't feel like a step closer to his goal. It felt like a trap. As he studied the surroundings, a low growl echoed through the clearing. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively moving to his knife. The growl came again, this time from behind him. Slowly, he turned. Emerging from the shadows was a creature straight out of a nightmare. Its sleek, scaled body was the size of a small car, its powerful legs ending in sharp claws that left deep gouges in the earth. Its eyes glowed faintly, fixed on Ethan with a predatory intensity. A pair of long, curved fangs protruded from its mouth, dripping with venom. "Okay," Ethan whispered, his throat dry. "This is new." The creature circled him slowly, its movements deliberate. It wasn't in a rush. It was the apex predator of this jungle, and it knew it. Ethan's mind raced. Running wasn't an option. This thing was too fast. Fighting it head-on with nothing but a knife. That was a death sentence. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. His eyes darted to the glowing fungi beneath the tree. They looked delicate, almost brittle. An idea sparked. If he could lure the creature toward the tree and use the fungi to create a distraction, he might have a chance to escape. Ethan slowly backed away, keeping his movements measured. The creature followed, its growls growing louder. He grabbed a small rock and hurled it toward the tree. The impact sent a puff of spores into the air, and the fungi released a bright flash of light. The creature recoiled, momentarily disoriented by the burst. Ethan didn't waste a second. He sprinted toward the tree, weaving between its massive roots. The predator shook off its confusion and let out a deafening roar, charging after him. Ducking behind a large root, Ethan grabbed a vine and yanked it free. He looped it around one of the low-hanging branches, creating a makeshift trap. The creature leaped over the roots, its claws tearing into the ground as it lunged for him. "Come on, just a little closer," Ethan muttered. As the predator charged, Ethan yanked the vine with all his strength. The branch snapped forward, striking the creature in the face and knocking it off balance. It tumbled into the glowing fungi, which exploded in a cloud of blinding spores. Ethan didn't stick around to see what happened next. He bolted out of the clearing, his heart pounding as the creature's roars faded behind him. He didn't stop running until he was sure he was safe. Collapsing against a tree, Ethan gasped for breath. His hands shook as he wiped the sweat from his face. The encounter had been too close, a stark reminder of the jungle's dangers. But he was still alive, and the Eterna bloom was still out there. Ethan clenched his fists, his determination burning brighter than ever. Nothing was going to stop him. Not rivers, not predators, not even the jungle itself. He had come too far to turn back now. Ethan's journey through the jungle had pushed him to his limits, but he knew he was close. The terrain began to change, shifting from dense vegetation to an open space filled with soft, golden light. The air was different here, calmer, almost sacred. His heart raced as he realized he had reached Solara's cradle, the legendary valley where the Eterna bloom was said to grow. The beauty of the valley was overwhelming. Towering crystalline structures jutted out from the ground, refracting the sunlight into rainbows that danced across the lush green grass. A tranquil stream wound its way through the center, its water so clear it sparkled like liquid glass. Exotic flowers bloomed everywhere, their petals shimmering with iridescent hues. But amidst all this beauty, one thing stood out. At the heart of the valley, nestled atop a small hill, was a single flower. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Its petals glowed softly, shifting between shades of deep blue and violet. It seemed to pulse with life, as if it held the heartbeat of the jungle itself. "The Eterna bloom," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with awe. As he approached, he noticed a faint hum in the air, almost musical, as if the flower emitted its own melody. Each step toward it felt heavier, not because of fear, but because of the overwhelming sense of significance. This wasn't just a flower. It was a symbol of everything he had endured, everything he had overcome. But reaching the bloom wouldn't be that simple. As Ethan got closer, he felt a shift in the air. The valley, so serene moments ago, suddenly felt alive in a different way. The ground beneath him trembled faintly, and the crystalline structures around him began to emit a low, resonant tone. Of course it wouldn't be easy, Ethan muttered, gripping his knife. From the stream, water began to rise unnaturally, forming into the shape of a serpentine creature. Its body shimmered with the same crystalline glow as the valley, and its eyes fixed on Ethan with an intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. This was no ordinary guardian. It was a sentient force, protecting the Eterna bloom from those it deemed unworthy. Ethan raised his hand slowly, trying to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to destroy it," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've come all this way because I believe in what it represents. Perseverance, hope, connection." The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as if it were weighing his words. Ethan felt the hum of the valley intensify, and he realized this was more than a physical test. This place was alive, and it was judging him. Closing his eyes, Ethan thought of everything that had brought him here, the challenges, the dangers, the moments of doubt. He thought of Leora's teasing smile, her challenge that had sparked this journey. And he thought of humanity, always striving, always pushing forward, even in the face of the impossible. When he opened his eyes, he stepped forward, his gaze locked on the Eterna bloom. The guardian shifted, its form flickering, as if it were testing him one last time. Ethan kept moving, his steps deliberate and calm. He reached the hill, knelt before the bloom, and gently touched its stem. The valley fell silent. The guardian dissolved back into the stream, and the crystalline structures dimmed, their task complete. Ethan carefully plucked the flower, cradling it in his hands like the precious treasure it was. For a moment, he simply stared at it, overwhelmed by the sheer beauty and the weight of what it represented. He had done it. Against all odds, he had found the Eterna bloom. Standing tall, Ethan looked toward the path that would lead him back to the settlement. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about showing that humanity could rise to any challenge. And maybe, just maybe, seeing the look on Leora's face when he returned. Ethan began his descent from Solara's cradle, the Eterna bloom carefully secured in a protective case strapped to his pack. The jungle that had once seemed hostile now felt different, less like an enemy and more like a living entity that had tested him, judged him, and allowed him to pass. Still, he knew his journey wasn't over. The path back to the settlement was long, and the jungle wasn't about to let him off easily. As he made his way down the uneven terrain, the ground beneath his feet suddenly shifted. A section of loose earth gave way, sending him sliding down a slope. He managed to grab hold of a thick root, stopping his descent just before he plunged into a deep ravine. "Well, that could have ended badly," he muttered, pulling himself up and brushing off dirt. The slide had cost him precious time, and the jungle seemed to sense his urgency. Thick vines blocked his path, and the air grew humid and stifling. The sounds of distant creatures echoed around him, some curious, others predatory. Ethan's heart raced as he pressed on, every step feeling heavier. He paused by a stream to refill his water flask, grateful for the brief respite. As he knelt by the water, he caught his reflection. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes tired but determined. He couldn't help but chuckle. Not exactly the hero Leora probably imagined, he said to himself. Just as he was about to stand, a low growl came from the shadows. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively moving to his knife. Out of the underbrush emerged a creature he hadn't seen before, smaller than the apex predator he had faced earlier, but no less dangerous. Its sleek, feline-like body moved with predatory grace, and its golden eyes locked onto him. "Really? Now?" Ethan muttered, gripping his knife tighter. The creature lunged, its claws swiping at him. Ethan rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. He scrambled to his feet, keeping his distance. The creature circled him, its growls growing louder. Ethan glanced around, looking for something he could use to his advantage. His eyes landed on a fallen branch, thick and sturdy. He grabbed it, wielding it like a staff. When the creature lunged again, he swung the branch, striking it across the side. The impact sent it stumbling back, giving Ethan enough time to put some distance between them. He didn't wait to see if it would come after him again. Sprinting through the jungle, he pushed himself harder than he thought possible. Every muscle in his body ached, but he refused to stop. The Eterna bloom was too important. He couldn't let anything happen to it, or himself. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ethan finally reached a familiar landmark, a towering tree with a unique spiral-like trunk. Relief washed over him. He was close to the settlement now, just a few hours away. The jungle, as if sensing his imminent escape, seemed to throw one last challenge at him. A sudden downpour erupted, turning the ground into a slick mess of mud and roots. Ethan slipped more than once, his hands and knees scraped raw, but he kept moving. The rain soaked him to the bone, but it also seemed to wash away some of the weight of the journey. He felt lighter, as though the jungle itself was acknowledging his perseverance. At long last, the lights of the settlement came into view, faint but unmistakable. Ethan let out a laugh, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He staggered into the clearing, drenched and battered but triumphant. As he approached, a small crowd gathered, their murmurs growing louder when they saw the protective case strapped to his pack. Among them was Leora, her eyes wide with disbelief, and something else Ethan couldn't quite place. "You actually did it?" she asked, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Ethan smiled, pulling the case off his pack and opening it to reveal the Eterna bloom, its glowing petals as radiant as ever. "Told you I would." For the first time, Leora seemed at a loss for words. Her teasing smirk was gone, replaced by awe, and something that almost looked like admiration. The jungle had tested Ethan, but he had proven himself in ways even he hadn't expected. And judging by the look on Leora's face, the journey had been worth every step. The settlement buzzed with excitement as Ethan returned, carrying the legendary Eterna bloom. People gathered around him, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Some congratulated him, others simply stared, as if they couldn't believe a human had accomplished what no one else had dared to try. But Ethan only had eyes for Leora. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her usual teasing smirk absent. Instead, her face was lit with something softer, admiration, and perhaps a hint of guilt. As the crowd dispersed, giving Ethan space to catch his breath, Leora stepped forward. "You really did it," she said, her voice quiet. Her gaze shifted to the protective case in his hands, the Eterna bloom glowing faintly inside. "I didn't think anyone could." Ethan smiled, exhaustion clear in his eyes, but his determination still shining. "You issued the challenge. I couldn't exactly back down." Leora hesitated, her pale blue fingers brushing a strand of white hair behind her ear. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. "Ethan, about that challenge." He raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" She sighed, folding her arms as she looked away. "It wasn't meant to be serious. When I mentioned the Eterna bloom, I thought it was just a myth, something no one would actually try to find." Ethan chuckled, though there was a hint of frustration in his voice. "Well, you underestimated humans then. We have a habit of doing the impossible." Her gaze snapped back to him, her expression softening. "I can see that now, but you risked so much. The jungle, it could have killed you." Ethan shrugged, his smile widening. "It almost did, a few times. But it didn't, and now I'm here with this." He gestured to the bloom. "So, what does this mean? Was it just a game to you?" Leora flinched at his words, the guilt in her eyes deepening. "It wasn't a game. She paused, struggling to find the right words. "The Eterna bloom isn't just a flower to my people. It symbolizes something important: connection, trust, perseverance. By finding it, you've proven yourself in ways I never expected." Ethan's smile faded slightly, replaced by curiosity. "Proven myself how?" Leora took a deep breath, as if preparing herself. "In our culture, the Eterna bloom is part of an ancient tradition. Anyone who brings it back from Solara's cradle is seen as worthy of forming a bond, a partnership." Ethan blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. "Wait, you mean?" Leora nodded, her cheeks flushing a faint violet. "I didn't think anyone would actually find it. I didn't think you'd take it seriously, but you did. And now." He stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "So this was some kind of test." "Not intentionally," she said quickly. "I didn't mean for it to be. But the fact that you succeeded means something. Not just to me, but to my people." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Wow, that's a lot to take in." Leora stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You didn't have to do this, Ethan. You didn't have to risk your life. But you did. And that says more about you than anything else could." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Then Ethan smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. "Well, I guess I've got one question." Leora tilted her head. "What's that?" He grinned. "Was it worth the risk?" She smiled back, her teasing smirk returning, but this time it was softer, more genuine. "You tell me, Earthling." As they walked back to the settlement together, the Eterna bloom cradled safely in its case, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He had faced the jungle and come out stronger, not just for himself, but for something greater. And judging by the way Leora looked at him now, he knew the journey had only just begun. The settlement celebrated Ethan's return with a gathering unlike anything he had ever seen. Lanterns hung from every corner, casting warm light over the square. Zorian musicians played their instruments, creating melodies that echoed through the night. Humans and Zorians alike mingled, sharing food, drink, and stories of Ethan's incredible journey. But amidst the celebration, Ethan's mind remained on Leora. She stood at the edge of the square, a soft smile on her face as she watched the festivities. The teasing glint in her eyes had been replaced by something deeper, a mix of admiration and gratitude. Ethan approached her, the protective case containing the Eterna bloom still in his hands. "Not joining the party?" he asked, his tone light. Leora glanced at him and smiled. "It's your moment, Earthling. You earned it." Ethan chuckled, setting the case down on a nearby table. "Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without your challenge." Her smile faltered for a moment, and she looked away. "I still feel guilty about that. I didn't think you'd actually try, let alone succeed." "Well," he said, his voice softening, "if I hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here. And I wouldn't have this." He opened the case, revealing the Eterna bloom. Its glowing petals illuminated the space between them, casting a faint blue light on their faces. Leora reached out, her fingers hovering just above the flower. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined." Ethan watched her, a warmth spreading in his chest. "So, what happens now? You said this flower symbolizes connection, trust. What does that mean for us?" Leora hesitated, her fingers brushing a strand of white hair behind her ear. "The Eterna bloom is more than a symbol. It's a promise. Among my people, presenting it to someone is a way of saying you're ready to forge an unbreakable bond. It's not something we take lightly." Ethan raised an eyebrow, a teasing grin forming on his face. "Are you saying I accidentally proposed to you?" She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Not exactly, but you've certainly made a statement." Her laughter faded, and she looked at him with an earnestness that caught him off guard. "Ethan, what you did, it wasn't just brave. It was selfless. You faced dangers most of my people wouldn't dare to confront, all for a challenge you didn't have to accept. That means something to me, more than I can put into words." Ethan felt his face grow warm, and he scratched the back of his neck. "Well, when you put it like that, I guess I did it because I wanted to prove something. To you, to myself, that humans aren't afraid to take risks, to face the impossible." Leora smiled, her eyes softening. "You've proven that, and more." A hush fell over the crowd as Crix, the elder who had guided Ethan at the start of his journey, stepped forward. His golden eyes gleamed with approval as he addressed the gathering. "Ethan of Earth," Crix began, his voice carrying through the square, "you have achieved what few have even dared to attempt. By retrieving the Eterna bloom, you have not only honored our traditions, but also shown the strength and determination of your kind. For this, you will always be welcome among us." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Ethan felt a wave of pride wash over him. He turned to Leora, who was clapping along with the others, her smile brighter than ever. As the night wore on, Ethan and Leora found themselves sitting by the edge of the settlement, away from the noise of the celebration. The Eterna bloom rested between them, its glow casting a serene light over their faces. "So," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what now?" Leora tilted her head, her eyes sparkling. Now, we see where this bond takes us. Ethan grinned. Sounds like another challenge. She smirked, the teasing glint returning to her eyes. Careful, Earthling. I've got plenty more where that came from. And as the twin moons rose over Zoria Prime, casting their light over the settlement, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something extraordinary.